Some people spend their entire lives chasing respect, only to discover that true dignity belongs to those who never ask for it. Ava Carter had learned that lesson long before anyone inside the Pacific Heritage Museum ever bothered to learn her name. At 31 years old, she arrived every morning before sunrise wearing the same neatly pressed Navy Museum uniform, comfortable black shoes, and a quiet smile that never seemed to disappear no matter how invisible she became. The grand marble halls echoed with the footsteps of wealthy donors, celebrated historians, and distinguished guests. Yet very few people ever noticed the black museum worker carefully polishing display cases, checking climate controls, and ensuring every priceless artifact rested exactly where history intended. Most visitors assumed she simply cleaned the galleries. Few realized she had spent years studying every exhibit after work, reading forgotten archives, and memorizing the stories behind thousands of objects, because history had always felt like the closest conversation she could still have with her late father. That Thursday morning, the museum buzzed with nervous excitement unlike anything Ava had seen before. News had spread that an influential Korean mafia boss would privately tour the museum before attending a confidential cultural investment meeting with city officials and international collectors. Security officers inspected every entrance. Curators hurried through the galleries carrying tablets and clipboards. Administrators rehearsed welcome speeches while florists replaced fresh arrangements that already looked perfect. Every employee had been instructed to remain invisible unless spoken to directly. Ava quietly continued preparing Gallery 7, where rare East Asian artifacts would be displayed during the exclusive visit. She carefully adjusted the angle of a ceremonial bronze mirror before stepping back to admire the balanced lighting across the exhibit. Behind her, two co-workers laughed softly without lowering their voices. "Imagine spending your whole life dusting treasures you could never afford," one whispered. The other smiled with obvious amusement. "She probably thinks reading museum labels makes her an expert." Ava heard every word. She simply picked up a polishing cloth and continued working with steady hands. Experience had taught her that defending herself rarely changed minds already committed to judging appearances. Across the hall, another employee hurried toward her carrying several heavy storage boxes. "Ava, take these downstairs. The VIP guests will be here in less than 20 minutes, and nobody wants service staff wandering through the main entrance." She nodded politely, balancing the boxes without complaint. As she crossed the expansive lobby, a wealthy visitor glanced at her name badge before looking at her with dismissive curiosity. "You must be very strong," he joked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "They always find the right people for the heavy lifting." Several people laughed. Ava offered only a courteous smile before continuing toward the service elevator. She refused to allow another stranger to define her worth. Unknown to everyone inside the museum, a line of sleek black vehicles had already entered the private courtyard. Security personnel immediately straightened their posture as the rear door of the lead vehicle opened. Richard Hayes stepped onto the stone walkway with calm confidence. At 74 years old, his silver hair contrasted sharply against his elegant black suit, while his composed expression revealed nothing about the influence that followed him across continents. Stories described him as a man whose decisions shaped fortunes and whose presence silenced entire rooms. Yet instead of immediately following the museum director waiting anxiously at the entrance, Richard paused. Through the towering glass doors, he noticed a quiet scene unfolding inside the lobby. He watched a black museum worker struggling to balance several heavy boxes while elegantly dressed visitors laughed, as though she belonged somewhere beneath their attention. He observed the way she never argued, never lowered her eyes in defeat, and never allowed bitterness to reach her face. There was only quiet dignity carried with every careful step. Richard remained perfectly still for several seconds before speaking softly to the head of his security team. "Who is she?" The question surprised everyone standing nearby because it was the first thing the powerful visitor had asked after arriving. No one answered immediately. The museum director simply glanced toward Ava with casual indifference before replying. "She is just one of our museum workers." Richard never took his eyes off her. Something about that answer felt profoundly incomplete. A single quiet decision can reveal more about a person's character than a lifetime of carefully rehearsed speeches. Richard Hayes followed the museum director through the grand entrance, while security personnel maintained a respectful distance. But his attention continued drifting toward the woman carrying heavy storage boxes through the polished marble corridors. The museum director enthusiastically described upcoming expansion projects, prestigious donors, and rare collections acquired over the past decade, speaking with the confidence of someone eager to impress an influential guest. Richard listened politely without interrupting, yet his eyes constantly observed details that others overlooked. He noticed how every employee straightened immediately when senior administrators approached, while Ava quietly stepped aside to allow visitors comfortable passage before continuing her work without expecting acknowledgement. She moved through the galleries with remarkable familiarity, instinctively adjusting a display light that had shifted only slightly and carefully realigning an informational plaque barely noticeable to anyone else. Her attention to detail suggested someone who respected history rather than simply maintaining a workplace. The private tour eventually reached Gallery 7, where priceless East Asian artifacts rested beneath carefully controlled lighting. Wealthy collectors, historians, and city officials gathered around a ceremonial display while photographers quietly prepared for a commemorative picture. The atmosphere felt perfectly orchestrated until an elderly donor, distracted by conversation, accidentally brushed against the velvet barrier surrounding a delicate lacquered ceremonial stand. The unexpected movement caused a beautifully carved bronze ritual vessel positioned near the edge of the display platform to tilt dangerously toward the polished stone floor. Gasps filled the gallery as several people instinctively stepped backward instead of forward. Before anyone fully understood what was happening, Ava reacted. She had been arranging museum brochures several feet away when she noticed the shifting balance. Without hesitation, she crossed the distance with calm precision, gently supporting the ancient vessel with both hands before it could slip from its stand. Every movement displayed remarkable care rather than panic. She slowly returned the artifact to its proper position, checked its stability, and immediately stepped away without drawing attention to herself. Silence settled across the gallery for only a moment before the museum director hurried toward the display with visible frustration. Instead of thanking Ava, he frowned. "What were you thinking?" he demanded sharply. "You do not enter a restricted exhibit during a private presentation unless instructed." Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. One administrator quickly added, "Fortunately, nothing happened." Ava lowered her voice respectfully. The support bracket shifted after the barrier moved. "I only wanted to prevent the vessel from falling." The explanation received little acknowledgement. The director sighed impatiently. "Security procedures exist for a reason. Please return to your assigned duties." Ava nodded once without arguing. She quietly collected the brochures she had dropped while rushing toward the display and prepared to leave the gallery. Richard had watched every second without saying a word. Unlike everyone else, he had noticed that Ava never grabbed the artifact recklessly. She had supported its weight exactly where structural stress would be lowest, demonstrating knowledge that extended far beyond ordinary museum maintenance. He also noticed something else. The support bracket she mentioned still leaned at a slight angle, exactly as she had described. Richard slowly approached the display after Ava walked away. He examined the stand before looking toward the chief curator. Was she correct? The curator hesitated before carefully inspecting the bracket himself. After several quiet moments, his expression changed. It appears one fastening point loosened when the barrier shifted. She prevented the vessel from falling. The museum director forced a polite smile. She has always been unusually observant. Richard remained silent. The explanation seemed strangely dismissive considering what had almost occurred. As the tour continued through adjoining galleries, Richard found himself asking unexpected questions. "How long has she worked here?" The director quickly answered, "Nearly 7 years." Richard raised another question. "What is her academic background?" This time the director seemed uncertain. "I believe she studied history for a while before family circumstances prevented her from finishing graduate school." Richard offered only a thoughtful nod. Hours later, while the official luncheon began inside the museum's elegant reception hall, Ava quietly returned to Gallery 7 carrying a maintenance kit. She knelt beside the ceremonial display and carefully replaced the damaged support bracket with a spare component stored beneath the exhibit, documenting every adjustment according to museum preservation procedures before signing the maintenance log with neat handwriting. She believed no one had noticed. Standing silently beyond the partially open doorway, Richard observed the entire process without announcing his presence. For the second time that day, he realized the woman everyone treated as ordinary possessed knowledge and professionalism that quietly protected treasures worth millions of dollars. And for the second time, he wondered why the people closest to her seemed determined to pretend they could not see it. Knowledge has a quiet way of revealing itself to those willing to notice what everyone else ignores. The afternoon sunlight filtered gently through the towering glass ceiling of the Pacific Heritage Museum, casting warm reflections across polished marble floors and centuries-old artifacts displayed beneath carefully balanced lighting. Guests continued wandering through the galleries, admiring priceless collections, while museum staff worked tirelessly to maintain the flawless experience expected from one of Seattle's most respected cultural institutions. Ava Carter quietly returned to her daily responsibilities as though nothing unusual had happened. She organized educational pamphlets, answered polite questions from curious schoolchildren, and carefully monitored the environmental sensors protecting fragile exhibits from changes in humidity and temperature. Although the museum director had dismissed her actions earlier that morning, she carried no resentment. Preserving history had always mattered more to her than receiving recognition. Richard Hayes, however, had not forgotten what he witnessed. Rather than joining private investment discussions scheduled inside the executive conference room, he asked the museum director for additional time to explore the galleries before the meeting began. The request surprised everyone because distinguished guests rarely extended museum tours beyond formal presentations. The director happily agreed, believing Richard wished to admire the institution's celebrated collections. Instead, Richard quietly observed the people responsible for protecting those collections. He noticed curators confidently explaining famous artifacts to wealthy patrons, while Ava moved silently through the background, ensuring every display remained perfectly maintained. She never interrupted conversations, never attempted to display her own knowledge, and never corrected inaccurate explanations offered by senior staff. Yet Richard began noticing subtle expressions crossing her face whenever historical details were presented incorrectly. Eventually, the group entered a gallery dedicated to ancient Korean ceremonial art. A distinguished donor proudly admired an intricately decorated bronze incense burner displayed beneath protective glass before asking an innocent question. "Is this original piece from the late Joseon period?" The chief curator immediately smiled. "Yes, it dates to the late 19th century. Richard glanced toward Ava standing several feet away adjusting gallery lighting. For the briefest moment, she hesitated before quietly lowering her eyes. Again, Richard recognized the expression immediately. It was the face of someone hearing a mistake while choosing silence out of respect. He calmly addressed the museum director. "May I ask the young woman what she thinks?" The request instantly changed the atmosphere inside the gallery. Several administrators exchanged uncomfortable glances. The museum director forced another courteous smile before replying. "She is not one of our curators." Richard answered with quiet confidence. "I asked what she thinks." Every conversation stopped. Ava looked genuinely surprised as everyone turned toward her. She approached respectfully, keeping her voice calm. "Would you like my honest opinion, sir?" Richard nodded once. Ava studied the artifact for only a few seconds before speaking. The decorative style resembles the late Joseon period, but the casting technique suggests it is significantly older. Notice the asymmetrical hammer marks beneath the lower handles and the unusually deep oxidation within the engraved cloud pattern. Those characteristics appear more consistent with an earlier transitional workshop. If I am correct, this piece was probably restored during the late 19th century, which may explain the catalog description. Silence filled the room. Her explanation was neither dramatic nor arrogant. She simply presented careful observations supported by visible details. The chief curator frowned before stepping closer to the display. After several long moments, he quietly requested the original conservation records from a nearby assistant. Everyone waited while aged documentation was retrieved from secure archives. Minutes later, the curator slowly lowered the folder, his expression transformed by reluctant surprise. The restoration report confirms exactly what she described, he admitted softly. The artifact itself predates its original classification by several centuries. The updated research was completed years ago, but somehow never replaced the older public description. No one spoke. Richard looked toward Ava with growing admiration. How did you notice? He asked. Ava smiled modestly. My father believed every artifact tells the truth if someone is patient enough to listen. She offered no further explanation before politely stepping back to allow the official tour to continue. The museum director attempted to recover the conversation with practiced enthusiasm, but something fundamental had already shifted inside the gallery. Richard no longer saw an overlooked museum worker. He saw someone whose knowledge quietly surpassed the assumptions surrounding her. As the group prepared to leave, his eyes rested briefly on the updated conservation folder, still lying open beside the display. Across the bottom of one aging research page appeared a faded handwritten signature identifying the scholar who first questioned the artifact's classification nearly 3 decades earlier. Richard stopped walking. The familiar name stirred a memory he had not revisited in many years, and for the first time since entering the museum, the past quietly reached forward to meet him. The smallest detail can change the meaning of an entire history, but only someone who truly respects the truth will notice it before everyone else. Richard Hayes remained standing beside the display long after the other guests had continued toward the next gallery. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the conservation folder, while his eyes remained fixed on the faded signature at the bottom of the yellowed page. Daniel Carter. The name echoed through memories that had remained silent for nearly 3 decades. He did not speak. Instead, he slowly closed the folder and followed the group with measured steps, his calm expression hiding the questions beginning to surface inside his mind. Across the museum, Ava returned to her afternoon routine without realizing that a single forgotten signature had altered the direction of the day. She inspected display cases, verified humidity readings, and greeted visitors with the same warm professionalism she offered every guest regardless of their status. To her, history deserved consistency. Every artifact received the same respect, whether admired by schoolchildren or billionaires. Nearly an hour later, while administrators escorted investors toward a private reception hall, a young collections assistant rushed into the conservation office carrying a small wooden storage box recently transferred from the museum archives. The assistant looked concerned as several senior curators gathered around the table. Inside the box rested an ancient ceremonial seal that had been scheduled for public exhibition the following month. During a routine inspection, staff members had discovered a troubling inconsistency between the object and its official documentation. Measurements recorded decades earlier no longer appeared to match the seal resting inside the protective container. The museum director frowned as specialists debated possible explanations. Some suggested that previous measurements had simply been inaccurate. Others believed normal restoration work had altered the recorded dimensions. No one seemed entirely convinced. Standing quietly outside the partially open office door while delivering updated inventory sheets, Ava overheard only fragments of the discussion. She never intended to interrupt, but one sentence immediately caught her attention. Someone mentioned that the seal's engraved family crest appeared slightly off-center compared to the original archival photographs. Ava hesitated for a moment before gently knocking on the door. Every face turned toward her with visible impatience. The museum director sighed softly. Yes, Ava. She remained respectful. I apologize for interrupting. May I ask whether the archival photographs include images of the underside? One curator answered. Only one photograph from many years ago. Ava nodded thoughtfully. Would it be possible to compare the grain pattern inside the carved base rather than the crest itself? Several people exchanged puzzled expressions. The museum director folded his arms. Why would that matter? Ava replied carefully. Master craftsmen often replaced worn surface engravings during restoration, but the interior carving beneath the base almost never changed because visitors never saw it. If the internal grain pattern is different, then the object itself may not be the original. The room became quiet. Although skeptical, one conservator retrieved the archival photograph from the museum database, while another carefully lifted the seal using preservation gloves. Within minutes, both images rested side by side beneath a magnifying lamp. One by one, the specialists leaned closer. The carved grain patterns did not match. The difference was subtle enough that few people would ever notice. Yet once revealed, it became impossible to ignore. The room filled with astonished silence. "This cannot be right," one curator whispered. Another quickly examined additional records before looking up with growing concern. The original transfer inventory from 30 years ago mentions a verification review that was never completed. Richard Hayes had quietly entered the office moments earlier after noticing the unusual gathering. Without interrupting, he observed every reaction as experienced historians gradually realized they might have been displaying a replacement artifact for decades. He turned toward Ava. "How did you know where to look?" She smiled gently, almost embarrassed by the attention. "My father always told me that people often repair what everyone sees while forgetting that the truth usually hides where nobody thinks to look." Richard felt those words settle deeply within him. They sounded familiar, not because he had heard them before, but because they reflected the same quiet wisdom carried by the scholar whose signature still lingered in his memory. As museum officials hurried to unlock deeper archival storage and retrieve forgotten acquisition records, Richard remained standing beside Ava in thoughtful silence. Somewhere inside those neglected files rested the answer to the mystery unfolding before them. And with every passing minute, he became more certain that the remarkable woman everyone had overlooked was connected to a chapter of his own life that he had never expected to reopen. The past has a remarkable way of waiting patiently until the right person arrives to uncover it. Within an hour, the atmosphere inside the Pacific Heritage Museum had transformed completely. The elegant confidence that had filled the executive offices earlier that morning gave way to quiet urgency as archivists, conservators, and historians searched through decades of forgotten records. Dust-covered storage boxes lined long wooden tables beneath soft reading lamps, while carefully preserved journals, acquisition logs, and restoration reports were opened for the first time in many years. The museum director personally supervised the review, determined to understand how an important ceremonial seal could have remained incorrectly identified for so long. Ava Carter continued assisting wherever she was needed without seeking recognition. She carefully organized fragile documents, handled archival gloves with practiced precision, and gently reminded younger assistants about proper preservation procedures whenever they became too hurried. Richard Hayes observed her from across the room with increasing curiosity. Every task she performed reflected quiet confidence rather than ambition. She never behaved like someone hoping to impress influential people. She simply respected the work itself. As the afternoon progressed, one elderly archivist finally carried forward a thick leather binder containing acquisition correspondence from nearly 30 years earlier. The binder had not been opened in decades because its contents had already been transferred into digital records long ago. As the archivist slowly turned each brittle page, Richard suddenly leaned forward. Several familiar names appeared among the handwritten notes, including respected scholars, restoration experts, and international cultural advisors he had known during another chapter of his life. Then one page stopped him completely. Attached beside a restoration photograph rested a handwritten technical review signed in dark blue ink. Daniel Carter. Richard reached for the page almost instinctively. Beneath the signature appeared detailed observations questioning the authenticity of several museum acquisitions and recommending a full investigation before public exhibition. Every conclusion had been supported with careful evidence, precise measurements, and remarkable restraint. There was no arrogance, no accusation, only a quiet commitment to protecting historical truth. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment as memories quietly returned. Nearly 30 years earlier, during an international cultural conference in San Francisco, he had met an American historian named Daniel Carter. While influential collectors competed to purchase prestigious artifacts, Daniel had refused generous financial offers to approve questionable documentation. Instead, he insisted that historical integrity mattered more than personal reward. Richard had admired the scholar's honesty because it could not be purchased. They had spoken only a handful of times, yet Daniel's calm conviction had remained unforgettable. Before Richard could speak, the elderly archivist turned another page and revealed a faded photograph clipped beside the report. It showed Daniel Carter standing beside a younger museum research team during an overseas preservation project in South Korea. Richard stared silently at the smiling face he had not seen in decades. Across the room, Ava noticed the photograph and walked closer without realizing what had captured everyone's attention. The moment she saw it, her expression softened with quiet affection. "That is my father," she said gently. "He always carried that same notebook everywhere he worked." Every conversation inside the archive room stopped. Richard slowly looked from the photograph to Ava. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same thoughtful eyes, the same calm posture, the same quiet dignity that never demanded attention. "You are Daniel Carter's daughter?" Richard asked, almost in disbelief. Ava nodded with a warm smile. "Yes, sir. He passed away several years ago, but he taught me almost everything I know about historical preservation. When I was little, he used to bring me into museum archives on weekends because he believed every artifact deserved someone willing to protect its story." Richard lowered his gaze toward the aging photograph once more. He remembered Daniel refusing recognition after solving an important authentication dispute years earlier. When reporters attempted to interview him, Daniel had quietly stepped aside and encouraged younger researchers to receive the credit instead. That memory suddenly explained everything Richard had witnessed throughout the day. Ava had inherited far more than her father's knowledge. She had inherited his character. The museum director stood speechless as the significance of the discovery slowly settled across the room. Employees who had overlooked Ava for years now stared at her with entirely different eyes. Yet Ava herself remained unchanged. She gently returned the fragile binder to the archivist, thanked him for preserving her father's work so carefully, and resumed organizing historical documents as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Richard watched every quiet movement, feeling a growing sense that destiny had brought him back to this museum for a reason he was only beginning to understand. Some debts cannot be measured by money because they were never created by money in the first place. Evening light settled softly across the Pacific Heritage Museum as the last public visitors drifted toward the exits, leaving the galleries wrapped in an almost sacred stillness. The executive reception had quietly ended, yet Richard Hayes remained inside the archive room, while most of the museum administrators gathered around the newly discovered records. Their earlier confidence had been replaced by thoughtful humility as forgotten documents continued revealing how many of Daniel Carter's recommendations had eventually proven correct despite being overlooked during his lifetime. Ava carefully returned another preservation folder to its climate-controlled cabinet before preparing to leave for the day. She believed the unexpected discoveries had finally concluded, but as she reached for her coat, Richard spoke gently. "Miss Carter, would you allow me a few minutes of your time?" She turned with quiet respect and nodded. They walked slowly into one of the museum's smaller reading galleries where tall windows overlooked the Seattle skyline, glowing beneath the colors of sunset. The room felt peaceful, lined with shelves filled with historical journals and restoration records collected across generations. Richard remained silent for several moments, as though carefully choosing words he had carried for many years. Finally, he looked toward Ava with sincere gratitude. "Your father once taught me something that changed the direction of my life." Ava looked surprised. "My father rarely spoke about the people he helped," she answered softly. Richard smiled with quiet understanding. That was exactly the kind of man he was. He slowly removed a small leather notebook from the inside pocket of his suit. Although worn by time, it had been carefully preserved. He placed it gently upon the reading table between them. 30 years ago, I was still learning that influence without integrity eventually destroys itself. During a cultural acquisition conference in California, I intended to purchase several artifacts through a private collection. Everything appeared legitimate. Every document seemed authentic. Every expert approved the transaction except one. Ava looked at the notebook without touching it. She already knew the answer before Richard continued. "Your father?" Richard nodded. "Daniel Carter politely asked me for one afternoon before I signed the agreement. He spent hours comparing photographs, restoration records, shipping logs, and handwritten catalog notes. At the end of the day, he proved that several important artifacts had been assigned false histories. He could have accepted an enormous consulting fee simply by remaining silent, but instead he protected the truth." Richard gently opened the notebook. Inside rested neatly folded papers alongside faded handwritten notes. I offered him financial compensation many times. He refused every offer. Ava smiled, recognizing her father's familiar principles. That sounds exactly like him. Richard looked out the window before speaking again. When I asked why he would turn away such an opportunity, he gave me an answer I have never forgotten. He said, "If history becomes something that can be purchased, then future generations will inherit beautiful lies instead of difficult truths." The words lingered quietly between them. Ava lowered her eyes, remembering evenings spent around the family dining table listening to her father speak with the same gentle conviction. "He used to tell me that every honest decision becomes a gift for someone we will never meet," she whispered. Richard felt a quiet emotion rise within him. "Your father gave me that gift," he explained. How Daniel's integrity had prevented him from entering partnerships with dishonest collectors whose reputations later collapsed under international investigation. By refusing to compromise historical truth, Daniel had unknowingly protected Richard's reputation and redirected his investments toward legitimate preservation projects throughout Asia and the United States. "He probably never realized what his honesty accomplished," Richard said. Ava smiled softly. "He never measured success by recognition. He believed that doing the right thing was already its own reward." Richard carefully closed the notebook before sliding it gently across the table. "He left this with me after our final meeting. He said that one day I would understand why preserving character mattered even more than preserving artifacts." Ava slowly opened the notebook. Inside the front cover, written in Daniel Carter's familiar handwriting, appeared a simple sentence she had not seen since childhood. "Protect the truth with kindness, because both become rare when people stop defending them." Her eyes filled with quiet emotion, not from sadness, but from hearing her father's voice through words preserved across decades. Richard watched silently, understanding that some reunions happen not through people, but through memories faithfully protected. Outside the reading gallery, several museum administrators happened to witness the respectful conversation through the glass doors. They saw one of the world's most influential men standing patiently, while an overlooked museum worker held the notebook of an ordinary scholar. None of them could hear the words being spoken, yet every person sensed they were witnessing something far more valuable than any artifact displayed inside the museum. And before the evening ended, Richard made a decision that would leave everyone who had underestimated Ava completely speechless. True respect is never announced with words because when it finally appears, silence speaks louder than applause. The following morning, the Pacific Heritage Museum opened its doors earlier than usual for a special gathering arranged before the public arrived. News of the previous days. Archival discoveries had spread quickly among trustees, historians, city officials, and major donors, many of whom accepted invitations to witness an important announcement regarding the museum's historical collections. Employees quietly prepared the central atrium, while conservators carefully displayed the corrected documentation beside the ceremonial seal, whose true history had finally been restored. Ava Carter arrived at her usual time, carrying a simple canvas bag over her shoulder, expecting another ordinary day. She noticed the unusual activity, but assumed it concerned senior leadership. As always, she greeted the security staff with a warm smile before walking toward the employee entrance. One of the administrative assistants hurried over and politely asked if she would wait in the main atrium, because the museum director wished to thank everyone involved in the previous day's discoveries. Ava nodded without asking questions. She stood near the back of the gathering, comfortable allowing curators and executives to occupy the front rows. Richard Hayes entered several minutes later accompanied by his security team, yet instead of taking the reserved seat prepared for him beside city officials, he quietly remained standing. The museum director stepped to the podium and welcomed everyone before proudly explaining that new archival evidence had corrected decades of inaccurate historical records. He praised the conservation department, the archival staff, and the institution's commitment to scholarly excellence. As he spoke, several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances because everyone in the room understood one important name had not yet been mentioned. When the director finally paused, Richard calmly stepped forward. His movement immediately drew every eye in the atrium. The director politely offered him the podium, assuming he wished to congratulate the museum. Richard accepted the invitation but remained silent for several seconds as his gaze slowly moved across the assembled audience. Yesterday, he began in a calm voice, I visited this museum expecting to admire artifacts that survived centuries. Instead, I discovered something even rarer. The room became perfectly still. Richard continued, I discovered integrity that survived neglect. He turned toward the back of the crowd where Ava stood quietly, almost hidden among museum employees. Miss Ava Carter, would you please join me? Surprise spread across the room. Ava hesitated for only a moment before walking forward with the same quiet composure she had shown throughout the previous day. She stopped a respectful distance away, uncertain why she had been called. Richard looked at the audience before speaking again. Many people saw a museum worker. I saw someone protecting history without expecting recognition. Many people saw an employee following instructions. I saw a scholar honoring principles inherited from an extraordinary father. The museum director slowly lowered his eyes. Several co-workers who had once laughed at Ava now stood completely motionless. Richard continued, Daniel Carter once taught me that truth loses its value when people reward appearances more generously than character. Yesterday, I realized his greatest legacy was not contained inside any book or archive. His greatest legacy is standing here. Ava's eyes reflected quiet emotion, but she remained humble. My father would have wanted the museum to receive the credit, she answered softly. Richard smiled with deep respect. That is exactly why he deserves to be remembered. Then, without ceremony or hesitation, Richard took one slow step forward. Every conversation ceased. Every camera remained perfectly still. In front of trustees, historians, executives, employees, and visitors, one of the most influential men in the room gently lowered his head in a respectful bow toward Ava Carter. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet it transformed the entire atmosphere of the museum. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence carried more meaning than any speech ever could. Ava looked genuinely overwhelmed. She instinctively shook her head and quietly said, Sir, that is not necessary. Richard slowly straightened and answered with calm sincerity. For 30 years I have searched for an opportunity to honor the values your father protected. Today I honor them through you. Around the atrium, people who had once overlooked Ava felt the weight of their own assumptions. The wealthy visitor who had joked about her carrying heavy boxes could no longer meet her eyes. The co-workers who had dismissed her knowledge stood with visible regret. Even the museum director understood that leadership meant recognizing quiet excellence before someone else had to reveal it. Ava did not celebrate the attention. She simply offered Richard a grateful smile and thanked everyone for preserving history together. In that moment, the museum's most valuable lesson was no longer displayed inside a glass case. It stood in plain sight, reminding every person present that genuine greatness always recognizes dignity before status. The deepest legacy is never written on stone because it continues living inside the people who choose to protect it. Long after the gathering ended, the atmosphere inside the Pacific Heritage Museum remained noticeably different. Employees who had once hurried past Ava Carter without a second glance now greeted her with genuine warmth. Curators invited her into conversations they previously held behind closed doors, and younger staff members quietly sought her advice while handling delicate artifacts. Yet nothing about Ava herself had changed. She still arrived before sunrise, checked every environmental monitor, polished display glass with patient care, and paused each morning before the portrait of her late father displayed in a small staff hallway, silently thanking him for the values he had placed inside her long before he left this world. Richard Hayes delayed his departure by another day, declining several business appointments that his assistants insisted could not easily be rescheduled. For him, there was something more important than contracts waiting inside the museum. Early that afternoon, he requested one final meeting with the board of trustees, senior curators, and department directors. Ava received an invitation as well, although she quietly questioned whether she belonged in such a distinguished gathering. When she entered the historic boardroom, every seat around the polished walnut table had already been filled except one placed. Near Richard, the museum director personally invited her to sit there, a gesture that would have seemed unimaginable only 48 hours earlier. After everyone settled, Richard slowly stood and placed an aged envelope upon the table. The paper had faded with time, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. "Your father gave this to me after our final meeting," Richard said while looking toward Ava. "He asked me not to open it unless I found myself questioning why integrity still mattered in a changing world." Ava looked at the envelope with quiet surprise. "Did you ever read it?" she asked softly. Richard smiled. "Not until last night." The room became completely silent as he unfolded the carefully preserved letter. He did not read every line aloud because many passages were deeply personal, but he shared the words that had remained with him throughout the night. Daniel Carter had written that museums were never built to protect objects alone. They existed to protect honesty, memory, and human character. He warned that future generations would face increasing pressure to value reputation above truth, convenience above responsibility, and recognition above service. Then came the sentence that caused every person in the room to lower their eyes in thoughtful reflection. "If one ordinary employee chooses truth when nobody is watching, then history is already safe." Richard gently folded the letter again before looking toward Ava. "Your father believed that greatness would never disappear as long as people like you continued doing quiet work without demanding applause." Ava felt tears gather in her eyes, not from grief but from gratitude. Hearing her father's words once again felt like receiving one final conversation she never expected to have. The museum director slowly rose from his chair. His voice carried none of the authority it had displayed earlier in the week. Instead, it carried humility. "Miss Carter," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. For years I appreciated your dedication without truly recognizing your wisdom. That failure belongs to me." Several department heads quietly nodded in agreement. One after another, they acknowledged moments when they had overlooked her ideas simply because of her position. Ava listened without satisfaction or resentment. She answered with the same grace that had guided every decision throughout her life. "My father always reminded me that respect grows stronger when it is shared, not when it is demanded. We all came here for the same reason. We wanted history to be protected." Her words dissolved whatever embarrassment remained inside the room. Richard then presented one final proposal to the board. He offered to fully fund a permanent research fellowship dedicated to ethical historical preservation, but with one condition. The fellowship would bear the name Daniel Carter, honoring a scholar who chose integrity over personal reward. The trustees unanimously approved the proposal without hesitation. As everyone quietly applauded, Ava looked toward the large windows where afternoon sunlight illuminated shelves filled with carefully preserved history. She realized her father had never truly disappeared from this place. His handwriting remained inside forgotten reports. His principles lived inside restored artifacts, and now his name would guide future historians long after everyone in the room became part of history themselves. Richard watched Ava's quiet smile and understood that honoring a person's legacy was never about remembering the past alone. It was about giving future generations someone worthy of following. The measure of a person's life is not found in the titles they earn, but in the quiet difference they leave behind after everyone else has gone home. 6 months passed, and the Pacific Heritage Museum became known across the country for something far more meaningful than its celebrated collections. Scholars praised its renewed commitment to historical integrity, universities partnered with its research programs, and young conservators applied from every corner of the United States hoping to study under the newly established Daniel Carter Fellowship for Ethical Preservation. Every orientation session began with the same simple lesson printed inside each welcome handbook. Protect the truth with kindness, because both become rare when people stop defending them. New employees often assumed the sentence belonged to a famous philosopher until they learned it had been written by an ordinary museum scholar whose greatest achievements had never been motivated by fame. Ava Carter continued arriving before sunrise, just as she always had. She politely declined several prestigious offers from other institutions, explaining that the museum had become more than a workplace. It had become part of her father's unfinished story. Although the board unanimously promoted her to Senior Historical Preservation Advisor, she insisted on spending part of every week walking the galleries, answering questions from curious children, assisting volunteers, and carefully inspecting exhibits with the same attention she had shown long before anyone recognized her expertise. Visitors frequently noticed the warmth with which she welcomed every guest regardless of their background. She believed history belonged equally to everyone willing to learn from it. Richard Hayes quietly fulfilled every promise he had made before returning to his international responsibilities. The fellowship flourished through his support, but he never requested his own name appear on plaques, programs, or public announcements. When journalists attempted to interview him about the generous contribution, he simply answered that history should celebrate those who protected truth rather than those who merely financed buildings. His words quickly spread through educational circles, inspiring conversations far beyond the museum walls. On a peaceful autumn afternoon, Richard returned without advance notice. There were no security announcements, no formal reception, and no media waiting outside. He walked alone through the familiar galleries until he reached a newly renovated exhibition honoring ethical preservation. At its center stood a modest bronze plaque beside one of Daniel Carter's original research notebooks. The display did not glorify awards or achievements. Instead, it celebrated quiet courage, careful scholarship, and the belief that integrity could outlast recognition. Richard stood silently for several moments before placing a single white lily beneath the display. Across the gallery, Ava noticed him and walked over with the same gentle smile she had offered on the day they first truly spoke. "You came back," she said warmly. Richard nodded. Some promises deserve more than one visit. They slowly walked together through the museum, watching families admire artifacts whose stories had finally been restored with complete accuracy. Near the entrance, a young boy tugged gently on his mother's sleeve and pointed toward Ava. "Is she the lady who found the truth?" he asked. His mother smiled. "Yes, but she would probably tell you that the truth was always there. She simply cared enough to look." Ava quietly laughed, humbled by the innocent observation. Before leaving, Richard paused beside the grand entrance where months earlier he had first watched a quiet museum worker carrying heavy boxes while others failed to see her worth. The same marble floor reflected the afternoon sunlight, but everything else had changed. Employees greeted one another with greater respect. Administrators listened more carefully before dismissing ideas. Young interns felt comfortable asking thoughtful questions without fear of being ignored. The museum had not merely corrected historical records. It had corrected the way people saw one another. Richard turned toward Ava one final time. "Your father protected history," he said softly. "You reminded us how to protect each other." Ava answered with quiet sincerity. "He taught me that every person carries a story nobody else can see. If we remember that, respect becomes much easier." Richard smiled before gently lowering his head once more, not because ceremony required it, but because gratitude did. This time, Ava responded with a respectful bow of her own, and neither gesture expressed power. They expressed shared humility. As Richard stepped through the museum doors into the cool Seattle afternoon, the galleries behind him remained filled with visitors admiring priceless artifacts. Yet the greatest treasure inside those walls had never rested beneath glass or inside a locked display. It lived quietly within ordinary people who chose honesty over recognition, kindness over judgment, and dignity over pride. And on that day, everyone who witnessed their story remembered what true respect looked like.